Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Open Democracy live discussion on a better approach to child work. We've got a great panel for you tonight, and we're very glad that you'll be joining us. My name is Thibos, and I'm the managing editor of Beyond Trafficking and Slavery, which is a section of Open Democracy. And for those of you who don't know us, we are a specialist part of Open Democracy, publishing material that helps people to better understand the dynamics and root causes of labor exploitation in the world today. And we have a rich site full of articles and reports and videos and other content on basically anything that gets referred to as labor exploitation or human trafficking or modern slavery. And we warmly invite you to come to our site and check us out and see what we have to offer. So our panel tonight is searching for a better approach to child work. And as some of you know, this year is the International Year for the Elimination of Child Labour. And for many reasons, not least the COVID-19 pandemic, the number of children working in the world today is going up and not down. And to do something positive for those children now, we at Beyond Slavery saw there was a need to change tact and to move away from trying to prohibit children from working outright to focusing on protecting and empowering them instead. And to that end, we commissioned this collection of articles with the help of 2 guest editors. And we've been also convened this discussion tonight. And so the setup tonight is relatively straightforward. We'll have 2 rounds of both presentation and Q&A. Our panelists will first each give some opening comments, and then they will answer a few of the questions that we gathered from your registration. And then I'll ask the panelists a follow-up question to the previous comments. And if we have time, we'll answer a few more questions that we'll be gathering from the chat. But to introduce our panelists before we get started, we have the legendary Kavita Ratna, who is the Director of Advocacy at the Concern for Working Children in India. We have Claire O'Kane, who is an independent consultant on child rights. We have Mavuto Banda, who is a former child worker himself and now a doctoral student at the University of Hull, and Mohammed Al-Rozzi. As some of you know, he was the guest editor of this series with another man named Edward Van Dalen. And I'd like to start with you, Mohammed. Since you're the guest editor, could you please just give us a quick lay of the land right now? So what does the fight against child labor look like now in most countries and in most policies? And when you look at that, why did you also think we needed a better approach to child work?
Thanks, Cameron. Thanks for having me. And it's been a pleasure to work with you and the guest editor, Edward Van Dalen, on this special feature, and also to work with all of the contributors to this special feature. I think just to give a bit of context to this kind of debate about eradication and the elimination of child labor, and it may help to put this into the context and the recent development in that domain. 2021 has been declared by the UN as the International Year for the Elimination of Child Labour. And in the UN General Assembly session, there was an encouragement to kind of join the march to eradicate all forms of child labor. Mm-hmm. And there was a special invitation for others to kind of capitalize on the work which has been done to eliminate all forms of child labor. And the reference is usually made to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and in particular target 8.7. And in that target, the promise is to kind of eradicate or eliminate all forms of child labor by 2025. Now, we all know, working in research or practitioners or even like listening directly to children, this is not going to happen. Of course, not this year, not in 25, probably not in 2050. The numbers, as you said, Cameron, has been increasing year after another. And rather than engaging with a game of numbers, I think we need to think what's going on here and to reflect on some of the practices and approaches which has been put in place for the last decades, actually for a century now, and to think about alternative ways to deal with the question of child labor. And maybe it helps here to think about the open letter, which was signed by more than 100 experts in the field, calling for a different way to think about child labor. It was published at the beginning of this year by openDemocracy, and there was an open invitation to kind of think about what has been done in that kind of battle against child labor, and to think about some of the potential and the impact of work on children and their families, especially in the context of COVID and climate change and all of these recent developments. And here it's maybe helpful to think about like this question: what's wrong with the ongoing dominant debate on child labor and this movement toward the elimination of child labor? I would say, first, it is based on a number of assumptions which sometimes lack research and evidence. And one of these assumptions is that work is intrinsically harmful for children, well-being, health, education, and morale. And through many research which has been conducted over the last 30 years, I would say that we come to know more about the reality of working children and to know more about the impact of work on their well-being. And what's wrong with this assumption is that it puts everything in one basket, basically. So it doesn't attend to diversity of the working experience. It doesn't attend to the working conditions of the working children worldwide. And it treats it as something which has to be prohibited altogether without really putting things into a context. And another held assumption has to do with the idea of coercion and the fact that children usually do this kind of work against their will. And again, we have a growing body of literature and research which show that children actually negotiate their kind of social kind of status through work. And sometimes they do this in the context of their society and community. Many of the children we spoke to would like to undertake work, and they feel the many benefits of doing work in their community, not only for themselves, but also for their families and communities. So I think instead of like just continuing to embrace this kind of dominant movement, which is led by many international organizations, I think we need to stop and think about why this approach is not working and what can be done. And I think the voices of children worldwide, the unions of working children, the practitioners, the researchers who have been working in this field can tell us a lot in answering this question.
Kavita, could you make this concrete for us? I mean, you've been a long-time advocate of child workers in India. And so could you introduce us to you and the organization you represent, and also tell us a bit about how some of the topics Mohammed just brought up in the abstract are concrete in India?
I'll gladly do that. And I'm very happy to be here, part of this whole fraternity, in fact. And thank you very much for posing these questions, which in a way actually feel like a deja vu to me. My organization is about 40 years old. And interestingly, we were the first organization in India which started working with child labor, even as an issue. And how that work started itself is very interesting. The founders of my organizations were actually part of the trade union movement. And I'm talking about early 1980s, where they would go to the trade union discussions and talk to adult workers. And while they were talking, there would always be these children carrying their lunch boxes sitting in the front because they were also workers. And invariably, whatever was told in the meeting about, the rights of the workers, health benefits, maternity benefits, the children would stand up and say, what about us? And at that time, India had the British law, which basically said children should not be working, period. And when children were told, you see, we can't do very much for you because you shouldn't be working. In fact, you shouldn't be existing. They said, but we do exist and we are working. So what do? Then children said, then maybe we should change the law. So my founders, who were 20, 21 at that time, said, okay, maybe we need to change the law of the whole country. I think that's the kind of daring young people can have, which has actually led us through these 40 years. So the first thing we did was actually to look at a new law for the country. And first time in the independent India, we started looking at a distinction between labor and work. And how do we distinguish between them? And the decision we came to later was anything which really harms the growth and development of child, we were calling labor, and anything which aids the growth and development of a child was work. And we stuck to the point of there were many, many things in work which were beneficial to the child. A lot of our children grew up working for families, age appropriate, culture appropriate. So the whole issue actually became a distinction between was it exploitative or non-exploitative. And when we started discussing with children about the law, what they said made a lot of sense. At that point in time, they could not see themselves out of a poverty situation. Their parents were poor. Their parents were migrants. Their parents need to live. So they took the work as a given. But they were saying, we want safe work. We want to also study and work. We don't want Provident Fund, but we want a scholarship fund. We want to be taught a vocation. We want to be told how to keep ourselves safe. And what is interesting is 40 years later, we're still saying the same thing, and we have to fight for the same thing. And what we also noticed that when we looked at children and work, most often, the first thing which is branded is economic poverty. They are poor. But it's not just economic poverty. We found that in families where equally poor, the sister was not sent to school, but the brother was. So there was a social poverty even within that economic poverty. And in some communities we found which were geographically very far away, children just had to go and fetch water and fuel. They were not poor, but they did not have resources. So we started mapping, saying what exactly is the reason. And we started looking at political poverty, that communities didn't have power to make decisions, even to say that I want this school, I want a healthcare system. So children were actually substituting a lot of services. They were playing a role which didn't always bring money, but which supported the family very substantially. And what we also saw was there was a lot of pride in children. And children who were contributing to it had a say in the family. So there was on an element of political decision-making within the family. So there were a lot of nuances. But all of this we could sense only from talking to children, listening to children, being with children, giving them the skills to actually analyze their own environment. That saying, what is my immediate cause? What is the deeper cause? And how to work through with them. And this has really been the foundation for our work throughout the years. And what we've always found is that if you start with the child at the center and also recognize that children are not saying only my right. I had a child who said, you don't want me to fetch water, but if I don't fetch it, my mother will fetch it. So nobody needs to walk 8 kilometers to fetch water. Not that I should not. It's not just about me. So for us, we could see that how they're so linked to their families, so linked to the communities, and all our responses had to embrace all of them if it had to make sense at all. And what we also saw, I mean, right now I'm speaking in the context of India, but much later in 90s, when we started working at the international level, being part of the international working group, looking at 33 countries worldwide, this is what children were saying. And what was very interesting is Mohammed referred to the unions of working children. We were part of the international movement of working children, where young people from 33 countries came together. And they said different things. There were kids from Brazil saying, we do not want to be working in sugarcane factories. There were kids from Philippines saying, we do not want to be in sex work. There were kids from Zambia saying, but we want to combine work and education. We want to work in the tea gardens, teach us. We had kids from India saying, I want to learn weaving, help me marketing. So the beauty was the range of issues they were raising and the need to have those conversations with them. And it was in these ILO conferences, these kids stood up and said, we are not pests to be eradicated. Mm-hmm. And we do not come from dysfunctional families. We are not from families where parents don't love us. They love us, but they don't have options. So I think the point Mohammed also made about bringing children into the discourse, analyzing the reasons in a very comprehensive manner, and building on the strength instead of treating them as zeros, I think has really been a starting point for us. And all our work since then to this day has been built on that. But what is very reassuring for many of us is even in countries like India, where this whole discussion had been so polarized, that if you are supporting children to form unions, that means you want child labor. And this is the kind of flack I've heard for 40 years, and I'm quite tired of it. But what is wonderful is that a lot of people who have been supporting ban, ban, ban are now saying, even in the Constitution of India, right to survival comes before right to education. We cannot take away the right to survive for children without giving them an alternative. And I'm hearing that, and it's very reassuring.
So thank you very much. Mavuto, you've worked as a child labor growing up in, or a child worker growing up in Malawi, and I assume that you can relate to a lot of what Kavita has been saying. And I was wondering if you could just introduce us to your story a little bit and tell us about how the sort of circumstances that you grew up in and the sort of economic trade-offs that you faced and how you negotiated them.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me here. Building up from Mohammed and Kavita, those are interesting concepts that are coming up. And well, according to ILO and UNICEF, by 2020, there was around 160 million children involved in child labor. So I think it's not about the numbers, it's also about the stories and faces behind those statistics. So I'm happy to share my story about that. I grew up in a small village in the southern tip of our country, Malawi, bordering Mozambique. And we are seven now in our family, raised by a single subsistent farming mother. And it was very difficult. From a small, an early age, we're able to know that if we want to have our basic needs, our daily needs, we have to work for those needs. And I learned from that from an early stage. And then there was a problem within our community, within our village. We couldn't find work that could pay us by cash. Most of the work that we could manage to get could pay us by giving us food. So there was a point that I really needed school materials, school uniform, learning materials. I couldn't find them. I had no option. I made a decision, and my peers, we trekked down to Mozambique. We traveled on foot for around 30 kilometers into the neighboring district in Mozambique. And that's where I got a job. Of course, in the process, I lost the whole term of that school year. But then the rest is history. This is where I am. I've gone through it, and I've benefited from working at an early age, because I don't think if I didn't make that decision to move and look for work, I could have made it where I am today. So that's one of the stories that we have behind all those statistics that we read in our offices. Yeah, that's what I can say in short. And yeah.
Thank you, Claire. So that's about as personal as we can get, but you can go much farther out. And you've participated in many, many meetings with organized children from around the world. And you recently participated in a series of about 30 of them, I think. And I was wondering if you could give us an introduction both to the landscape of organized child workers, because I think just that phrase would catch lots of people off guard, but also then tell us a little bit about what those aggregate demands were out of the course of these 30 panels that you participated in.
Okay, so maybe I think there's different things there. The organized children have been organized, I mean, historically much earlier, but particularly over the last more than 30 years in Latin America, there's a strong movement of working children and adolescents that have been organized with grassroots groups and have national delegates and link up across the region. Again, in India, the group Kavita is organizing, is part of the, they've been collaborating with the Bhima Sangha Working Children Union there for almost over 25 years, almost 30 years again now there, and similar with a union in the north of India, and over the more recent years, a number of unions in India. Again, Africa has a strong African movement of working children and youth across more than 30 countries. Again, I think about the first association was in 1994, so going back again over 25 years. And where the meeting Kavita mentioned earlier was when children came together from 33 countries from organised working children in Kundapur, where their organisation is based, and had this Kundapur Declaration. So the movements across Latin America, Africa and India have been closely connected again since earlier than that, since the mid 1990s. The project I have been part of for a number of years has been working with children who are organised in children's advisory committees, some who are members of existing working children's organised movements, but also a lot that weren't. So they were part of NGO programs and a range of NGOs that had very diverse ideological, pragmatic positions around children's work and labour. Some that had no work previously, say on children's work, but might have been working on education or social protection. But it was basically the kind of what the paper I've shared builds upon is 29 children's committees across 18 countries, again in Latin America, Africa, Middle East, Asia, and some countries in Europe. And the children came together in groups, often about 15 members, and they through the local NGO they were part of, they came together through a series of regular meetings. So Kavita had mentioned, for example, the importance of children analysing their own issue, and that kind of analysis and information being power. So children would come together, some again already were part of groups, they knew each other, some were new to groups. So the importance of getting to know one another, trusting one another, and then really analysing exploring their working lives. So they did activities like a body mapping of what do they like about their work, what do they not like about their work, what do they see when they're working that they like, that they don't, with the responsibilities, what kind of responsibilities do they like to have, what they don't. So a whole series of practical activities just to explore and share their working lives, looking at a day in the life of a child, and again, how they juggle work and school and other activities, thinking about what work they think they can and cannot do, or should and should not do. And once they kind of explored their lives together, and again, there was quite often gender differences, again, around what girls and boys liked doing or didn't like, or the way they were treated, and differences among different age groups. But they then, as groups, prioritized an issue that they wanted to try and change. And they then analysed those issues. So we'd use like a problem tree to look at, again, what's the underlying and the root cause of this issue, and what can we do as a group of children, often supported by staff in a local NGO, to try and change this? Who do we need to meet with? Who do we need to dialogue with? Or what action can we take to try and influence this and have more say? So this was all part of a Time to Talk project supported by Thibos and Kinder Not Hilfe, but working with about 50 local NGOs, and is now kind of moved into a new Dialogue Works project, because we really just realized actually it's not even enough for adults to listen, just children to say and adults to listen. What we really need is dialogue. So there's a conversation about what's going on here, and that real, like, taking the time to actually not just have a one-off meeting, but listen and discuss and understand. And I think the importance also in the early work to now is looking also, how do you really involve caregivers? Because again, most caregivers also want what's good for their children. So there's sometimes this blaming, oh, it's just parents, naughty parents sending their children to work. And, you know, there's so many issues there of why children might be working, and parents also want what's good for children. So looking at these spaces, dialogue between children and caregivers, among caregivers, children and local governments or national governments. And when we analysed the different, because every children's committee was working on their own priority, when we analysed across these 29 committees, we found there were 5 main common themes or priorities that have regularly emerged. And so the first really builds upon what Mohammed and Kavita and Mavuto have all said, that children want protection from labour exploitation. They don't want to be doing work that's too heavy, too dangerous, bad conditions, and also just the nature of the relationship between whoever they work with. That could also make something a good or bad job. It's not necessarily the nature of what they're doing, but the quality of relations within that place. But many of them were really saying, again, but we do want to work. We do want to do work that's suitable to our age, and we want to help families. We want to learn skills. We want to earn money to to buy whatever we need to work. So they're very clear about the need, again, not to stop everything, but to just really get protection from exploitation, but to be allowed to do suitable work. And particularly the children who were organized in Latin America really emphasized this importance of dignified work, and that they were recognized as a positive, the value of their identity of working children. From a number of groups, they really prioritized violence and discrimination that they face in the workplace, in their communities, in their schools, and how the violence is really just something really negative that needs to be addressed in all of those different settings, and how violence in schools was one of the push factors to actually leave school and then get involved in work. As again, as Mavuto and others have, and Kavita have stressed, the poverty that children were really saying we need to address. Governments, NGOs, everybody needs to address poverty. They need to provide decent work for our parents and our caregivers, and our basic needs need to be met, which included things like some groups in Latin America focused in Paraguay. I remember the group focusing on clean water, because they're saying, again, the problem for them wasn't working. They valued the work they did, but they said we're in communities where the rivers are polluted and we can't get decent water for our families. So this is the priority. So it really came to, I guess, a range of like indivisible needs and rights that children have that needed to be addressed. And then again, the priority of education. For, again, the dynamic of some children balance very well the work and study, and some didn't. You know, if their parents didn't prioritize education as much as the work, then they struggled, or if the school hours were really long, or if the school was inflexible. So the group in Peru, again, were part of an organized, a very well, Mantok has been very organized for many years. They really emphasize, you know, the school, children shouldn't have to fit around the school system. The school system should fit around children and their needs, and be flexible to their needs as working children, and provide relevant quality education. So in the current time with the climate crisis, with the pandemic, you know, there's so much question about actually what is relevant education. And we worked again with working children with disabilities, who really emphasise the importance of, again, that education being inclusive, or again, refugee working children. How can that be inclusive if you're in a country that's not your own, inclusive and relevant? And then cross-cutting to all this was listen to us, you know, really listen to us. And at every level, the government, employers, parent caregivers, teachers, head teachers, and implement laws that respect our rights. They said often there's laws, but those laws aren't respecting our rights, or they're there in paper and they're not being implemented, they're not being monitored. So how can you really kind of better implement and monitor what's going on? And they said, we can help you monitor them. Like we can tell you what's working and what's not working.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for all your answers. We have gotten a couple of questions from, as I said, that we gathered during the registration process. And I would remind our audience that if you're hearing anything that interests you, please do write in some questions into the chat and we'll try to get to them at the end. But Kavita, I wanted, we have a lovely question here from Brian O'Shea. And you mentioned, you alluded to it in your opening remarks, but sort of what is the most common response you receive when you tell a new person that you advocate for child workers? Like, how does that play at parties?
I think most people understand when you say we are working for the issue of child labor. Yes, great, wonderful, needs to be done. Earlier, of course, when we started, it was, oh, but child labor is a necessary evil. That's a very Indian way of saying, but we've got to live with this. And then the issue was when we started saying, no, but we're helping working children get organized, form the unions. Then it was, oh, then are you, just a moment. Just a moment, Malik can turn the alarm off. Just a minute, I'm sorry. The phone alarm off, please. I'm so sorry. Yeah. So the next challenge we had was when we said, no, we are helping working children get organized, that they have a right to be organized, they have a right to negotiate, they have a right to be their own first line of defense. We took a lot of flack for saying, A, that you're politicizing children, B, you're unionizing children so that the working conditions get better, which means then they'll continue to work, that you're not challenging it head on. And this we had for the longest time. But what we saw was that when Working Children's Union, Bhima Sangha, was formed in 1990, the kids took up issues also related to all of children's rights, not just as workers' rights, but as all of children's rights. And then the community started seeing the benefit of it, because these children are not just working children. They have a whole identity, which is more and beyond that of being working children. So when they started seeing that these children were able to get traction with officials, which parents couldn't even make eye contact. These kids are walking into their offices and saying, what are you doing? What is the benefit? How can you do this? So suddenly there was a respectability built on that. So much so that we had school-going children lying that they were working children to be part of this union. Because this union was actually being listened to. People were calling them for meetings. Government officials were calling them for meeting. Now, this went on till about mid-94, 95, 96. There was a lot. And I think, just to add to what Claire said, today, if you're talking of children's right to participation, it was the working children worldwide who made that path. They were the ones who fought and said children need to be heard. And today, a lot of other kids are being heard, but these kids were at the forefront when nobody bothered to listen to children. So till about mid-90s, Bhima Sangha and a lot of other children's movements were seen, they were heard. They may not have been agreed with, but they were heard. But then when the whole issue of exports and boycotting and banning products related to child labor happened, especially from the Western world, there was a very clear polarization. So suddenly it was illegal to be seen, illegal for our children to put the yellow headband saying, I'm a member of the union, because they were criminalized. And so much so that these kids actually had to not be seen. And you just imagine that these are working children who are fighting for their rights, rights of other children. And because of a very black and white understanding of children's rights, they get pushed underground. They can't be seen at all. And we saw that for about 5 years. And we took the flag. And we took the flag, our children took the flag, saying, what are you doing? But what came around was the fact that when they started, children also became part of the citizenship movement, which was kind of a backdoor entry, saying children are citizens and we're also workers. That came a full circle. And now there are a whole lot of organizations around the country asking us, how do we do this? How do we mobilize children? How do we help them with doing their own research? How do we help them negotiate with local governments? So we have seen that shift happening. And also why that shift has happened is just a simple example. Like Claire said, children are saying we will monitor. One example, in the villages where we work, children raise their problems, be it related to work or otherwise. For every problem they find, they tie a red ribbon in front of the local government's office. So if a local government's office has 18 red ribbons on them, that means they have raised 18 issues. And when the problem is solved, that red ribbon is replaced with a white ribbon. So the smallest of the child in the village is able to say whether my local government has been serving me well or not. Now, this has benefited all the community members. So we have been able to come back into that space. So we went through an absolute underground existence in a way on this issue and had to fight through other entries. But now I think we are back in the bank.
You're on mute, Cameron.
Thank you very much. And we have a second question as well from Jack Beadsworth. And this is sort of a question to both Claire and Kavita, I think. It is, so what is the appropriate role of trade unions, both in the global South, but also in the global North, I would assume, with regard to organizing and empowering child workers, if there's a role there at all?
Claire, would you like to go first?
I think you go first, Kavita.
Okay. I think that's a very interesting question, because when my founders started working with working children, they went to the trade union which they were a part of, saying, you see, there are a lot of these workers. I'm talking about early 80s. All of these children, and they are workers, so what do we do? And they were told by their trade union that we have too much on our hands already. There's so much work to do with other trade union members, we can't take on children. So not relevant. That is when my founders moved out of that and started work directly with children. Now, midway, I'm talking about, and for the longest time, they were more or less ignored by trade unions. But when the whole ILO discussion started with the ILO Convention 182 and extreme forms of child labor, and the discussions were happening, we were part of many discussions where working children and trade union members were sitting face to face. it was very, very, what shall I say, the wall was too high and too fat, because the adult trade unions basically thought that children were replacing adult work. So they had to go out so that adults could come in. But the children were trying to say that the work they were doing was the work no adult would even touch with a barge pole. So it was not that they were replacing any adults. It was not that at all. And in any case, if those jobs were taken up by adults, they couldn't be earning even peanuts. So that wasn't even the argument, but they were really saying that children should not be here and adults should be in their place. And that was a large, very, what shall I say, a very popular narrative for a very long time. Except that by late 90s, some of the trade unions, I think it was INT, the International Trade Union Movement, etc., started saying that those workers above 14 can be part of the unions, but cannot be official members. So they started recognizing there was a distinction between adolescents and children, I think. And now what has happened is in many countries, at least in South Asia, there's a distinction even by law of child workers and adolescent workers. In India now, adolescent workers can do safe job, which de facto means they can also be part of trade unions. So we are trying to see how to optimize that. So that's the space we are more or less in now.
Yeah, and I think building on what Kavita said, I mean, I think there are trade union organizers. They've got that role to make all workers aware of information that can increase their rights, can increase their health, the access to health or safety or the kind of fair pay. So whatever the age, I think they've got that role. We have seen, in the work with the Time to Talk work when some of the steering group members were trying to get people on side to support children to be heard, then some trade unions were initially positive, and then they would often withdraw back because they were like, oh no, we've got to be in the official position, no child can work. So we didn't want you to get into water that was seen as muddy, of like that distinction of different ages. But I think in different country contexts, we're seeing exactly what Kavita said, that there is an increasing recognition that adolescent workers in particular, that of at legal age, trade union are supporting and making sure those young workers are really aware, especially as they're of their rights alongside other workers, and of any different services they should be entitled to because of their age. I've also been in situations where children have been organized as children and had their own trade union, and then they've moved in, they've become adults, and they've said there isn't even an adult trade union here. So they have created their own trade unions, adults, based on their experience of organizing as young people, and have reached out to other workers in a similar position. So we also see children who are got the skills of trade union organizing, who then carry on as kind of trade union organizers as adults because they've gained those skills. So it goes, again, both ways of who can support who, which is quite interesting.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time, so I'd like to move us on to the second round of this webinar. And Mohammed, I'd like to start with you again, because you guest edited this feature, but you're also a researcher of child workers in Palestine. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the landscape of child work there and what you've observed as the impact of work on the children and their families there.
Thanks, Cameron. I did my PhD in social anthropology in Gaza, in Palestine. And in my research, I focused on children work and education in the Palestinian context, with special focus on the Gaza Strip. And as part of my research, I had a chance to speak with a wide range of actors, but also including children and their families, doing interviews with 3 generations of Palestinians, looking in particular at the relationship between work and education in the context of political activism, foreign aid, and state building. So it was about like giving a context about work, and a context for work and education, and how these 2 things relate to each other. And rather than engaging with a question around what are the main reasons for child labor, being the poverty, for example, I decided to go a step further by looking at the qualitative aspects of children work, rather than looking at the statistics and how many children are in work. I thought it will be helpful and beneficial for this kind of debate to look at what do children do, and how work is helping them or not helping them in their lives and in the lives of their communities. To give you an idea, a general idea about children work in Palestine, children work in many sectors, including in agricultural sector, but also in trade. You can see them as street vendors. They work in mechanic workshops. Sometimes in they work, let's say, in a dignified kind of situation, but working conditions sometimes are not. And what I came to know through my research is that many of the children who work, they do this on a full-time basis, sometimes kind of in combination with the school. So they do it after school. Sometimes they work with their relatives, their families, and sometimes with their friends, or they are sometimes self-employed. So they run their own kind of business, which tell you about also the agentic aspect of work for those children. And I also came to know, like, through this research, in fact, it was one of the main findings of my research, that at some point I came to realize that work become a space for negotiation of the status within their society, especially in the patriarchal society. And this is something which I'm sure has been also reported in many different contexts around the world. In the patriarchal societies, children are usually perceived as inferior in relation to the adults. And in this context, work become a way to signify their contribution and to say that we are not just invisible children, but we can do more. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the something which struck me when I was doing my research, that they are aware and they are conscious of these kind of negotiations. And they are consciously using this space, the space of work, to say that, okay, we deserve to be heard to, and we should be listened to, and our say should be taken into consideration, not only in the family circles and within the community, but also in the wider circles, including in the school and in the streets. And in fact, in many cases, children were saying that how this negotiation helped them. So how it impacted them to be seen more visible, their contribution to be celebrated and appraised within their community, how they this contribution made them feel part of something bigger, and how their contribution, although very small, was kind of appraised and celebrated by their families, because it's a sign that those children are developing a sense of responsibility. They are trying to be more independent. They are building their own peer groups, and they are trying to be part of their society, not like just like being separated from all of the economic and social and cultural problems that are there. And in that sense, children should be seen as, in fact, partners, rather than seen as like, okay, they are still, it's not the time for them, keep them invisible. And once they turn 18, we start like judging them by their actions and anticipating them to be fully fledged like adults, for example, and place certain kind of expectations on those adults. And also in my research, I came to look at the relationship between work and education and how these two areas relate to each other. Usually in the agenda on like for the elimination of child labor, we usually it's perceived as two spheres which are incompatible, but I came to learn a lot of stories about children who were able to combine both of them, and they were kind of giving reason for that. So one is about the present, being the work, which helps them in their negotiation, and one is about the future, securing future jobs. So this kind of rationale, to be honest, make a lot of sense. And it show the agentic aspect of how children can like really think about the present and the past. It's just for us, sometimes adults, we tend to underestimate this kind of contribution, or we think that children are not ready yet to form opinions about money, about life, about being part of the society. So I think these were some of the key areas which I came to know. And in fact, usually we tend to think that children drop out of school to work, but this is not also true. in a lot of cases, school become not a very welcoming environment for the children, probably because they are not like high achievers, let's say, in their schools. And at some point they decide to drop out school and they find a lot of spare time and they decide, okay, what about getting involved in a vocational training? What about doing this and that? So the reality in general tells us a lot of details about the reality of those children and the main motives behind their work. And I think it's very important to keep listening, as Claire and Kavita and Mavuto said. We need to continue listening and to take the says of children more seriously, because this is the only way, to be honest, to think differently about work and a better approach toward work and children work in general.
And Kavita's been doing quite a lot of listening lately. You're recently part of a very large conference, it sounds like, with working children across India, and that took place in April this year. And it produced a very long document of recommendations and ideas about how people and policymakers could support children during this pandemic. And I was wondering if you could highlight just like one or two of the ideas that they had or the points that they made that you think could be considered sort of low-hanging fruit that people or the policymakers could do now without having to reinvent their minds about everything that have to do with this topic.
Yeah, I'll certainly do that. And actually, a lot of what Mohammed said just now also resonates with what they were saying. This whole thing of children not being actually dropouts, but pushed out of school. And also that a lot of children combining work and education, in a way, working in order to support their own education as well. You know, and we saw a large number of that in India. And I think in this consultation, which you referred to, which was actually called Children Ambassadors of Change, it involved unions of working children from 8 states of India. And they were collaborating during pandemic. I mean, from cowsheds and factory floors and vending spaces, all from where they were working, they were kind of getting onto these WhatsApp calls and trying to have these conversations, which was quite extraordinary. Actually, you asked me to mention 2, but I'll very quickly talk of 5 key points, and very quickly, I'll be very quick.
Very quickly.
One thing I think which also said, again, resonates with what Claire said. I'm reading out from their document because they spent a lot of time getting the wordings right. And I think it'll be just justice to share that in the way they have said it. Like they've said, we working children and adolescents are penalized and punished for our realities, our backgrounds, and because we work. We work because we have to survive and to support our families. Laws that penalize us should not be implemented. Very straightforward. They also talk of laws allow adolescents to work in safe jobs. It's very important for our survival and also to be able to support our own studies and our families. If we are compelled to or choose our work, our place of employment must be safe for boys, girls, and children from other genders. This they put very concretely, this idea of other genders. And they're also saying that government should ensure safe employment to adolescents who have not received any schooling or formal education. There are a large number of us. And they're also saying that even though adolescents are allowed to work in safe occupations, because there's a scarcity of safe occupations, many of us are forced to take up hazardous work. This is something which should be changed by the government. And they also specifically make a point of how girls should be safe, and they make a lot of points related to safety of girls and protection of girls. And they also talk of how they want professional training, opportunities for learning, entrepreneurship, learning skills, opportunities to learn with education. And they also talked about how they want specific unique plans because they said each of our groups are unique and different and our circumstances are different. So give us opportunities to go ahead in life. We understand education is very important, but there are many of us who have not found getting education easy or useful. And they talk of wanting to earn and learn. I think learning and education, none of them are saying is not important. All the recommendations which are related to work and education was about combining both from a safe of safety and protection. But all their other recommendations, which are also available, also talk of agency, including on issues related to age of consent, age of marriage, aspiration, identity. So I think I'd like to bring this point back into this discussion, that the children we are talking about are children. Work is one part of their life. It's not all of their life. They are young people, they are citizens, they're part of a religious community, they're part of a national fabric. So all of their rights, the indivisibility of right which Claire talked about, is not just as working children, but as children, as young people. All of that has to be brought center stage in anything we demand. And that's what kids have made very, very clear. And also last point, these kids are now going to work on preparing an alternate report for the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, because India will be coming up for hearing very soon. So that's what they're working on right now.
Thank you. And Mavuto, sort of the same question to you. You've worked also as a development practitioner in Malawi for over a decade, I believe. And from your experience, like, what is sort of a couple key things or a couple key areas that could be focused on or done to benefit working children in Malawi now and that seem politically feasible?
Yes, I think the response, policy response and interventions have to be locally led. Locally led in terms of staff as well as local communities. I mean, solutions that are formulated within the communities or within where the issues are, most of the times work, because people put their efforts into those solutions. I'll give you an example. In schools, after identifying that we have had girls dropping out of school, most schools, most communities close to schools as part of the school management, there are mothers who organized themselves. These mothers encourage girls to continue with their education. There are some girls that maybe got pregnant and gave birth, and they're encouraged to go back to school. So this is done by women's groups called mothers groups within the community, close to the school. They live within the same community. They know the problems these girls face each and every day. At the same time, from my own experience working in the development area, I've seen that when I was being employed for one thing. For example, women inclusion in the economic arena. And then after working for some time, going to the field and coming back, you could hear issues coming out from the community. Those issues, I could report them. I could also write some comments and summaries about those reports. And also there were some projects that emanated from those reports. And surprisingly, those projects, they are the ones that are now the mainstay of the organization within the country, because those projects were responding to the real issues that the community faced. I'll give an example of when we started with the financial inclusion project, and then people talked about climate change and environmental degradation, and they said, no, we want to plant trees, we want to plant trees and also make sure that we take care of our environment. And then what could we do? We started a project that could support communities to rehabilitate their environment. At the same time, 3 years, they have been planting trees. And then they suggested we want a program that we could do around beekeeping, because we now have trees. We are now growing trees, but then we can't just leave trees like that. We are rehabilitating our environment, but we also need to find an income, diversify our income at the same time. So we also supported them in the program, whereby they started now, they were involved now in beekeeping. At the very same time, when they were doing that, they also realized that they have changes in terms of cooking power, for example, firewood, because with the increased pressure, increased population, the pressures on the forests, on the trees they were planting, they thought of bringing in another idea of maybe trying to reduce pressure on the trees. So the cooking, fuel-saving cooking stove project came in to solve that. And finally, at the end, before I left, they were also talking about, we are living in the rural areas. We don't have access to the national grid of electricity. We need power, but how? that's when they suggested a project about off-grid solar solutions to the communities. And then farmers started accessing the off-grid solar lights, and also workers within the state also started accessing that. So you can see the impact of these follow-up projects. The impact was huge because it was coming from the communities. It was coming from the people who are facing the issue. So in the issue of child labor, I think we have to look at children that are already in work now. We can't just withdraw children from work. I'll give you an example of a project on supporting National Action Plan on Child Labor in Malawi that was being implemented by the government of Malawi, but also supported by the UN ILO. They identified girls that were working in homes, not so boys that were working in homes, but some of them, they couldn't be withdrawn and put back into school because of their age. So what they did was that they enrolled these girls and boys into part-time vocational skills training institutions. So they could spend maybe 2 hours a day going there to learn about maybe carpentry, tailoring, and other skills that could help them if they leave that job in future. So I think this is in line with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Children, especially on the article number 3, that everything that we are going to do, us as practitioners, us as researchers, us as whether the private or the public, it has to be in the best interest of the children.
Thank you. And I know we're bumping up on time, but I wanted to get to Claire really fast and combine my follow-up question with a lovely question from Charlotte Bagshaw in the chat. So you've worked with many of the big NGOs in this field and understand their political constraints quite well. And so I wondered if you could tell us a couple of things that they also could possibly do to support this new approach. But also Charlotte asks, do you think that the global norms surrounding child labor and childhood that are promoted by groups like Save the Children are counterproductive to protecting children and their rights, or if there's a place for that as well? So over to you as the closing act.
Yeah, I mean, I think Save the Children, even among Save the Children, I'm not sure if they've got the same perspective, so that's a harder one to answer. But I think, you know, Mavuto emphasized the best interests. I think everybody can say what's in the best interest of children, but again, it comes to, for me, it always comes back to how do we listen to children? So how can, I think the low-lying fruit and the work for, you know, Save the Children and the other big NGOs, they do have a rights-based approach to a lot of them. And so if you really take seriously the principles of making decisions in children's best interest, of listening to children, of ensuring children's survival and development and non-discrimination, then we'll be on the right track. But it's like, how do we really listen? And I think in terms of the low-lying fruit, whether you're an NGO or a government or a school or an employer, is how do we really better create this space to really seriously listen to children, to caregivers, as Mavuto said, to communities, so that things can be responded to based on local realities. Because, you know, some people say, oh, what's working children's views on, as if there's one view. You know, if you asked, oh, what do adults think about their work, you would say, well, which adults, which country, which context. It's exactly the same with children. You can ask a group of children on your right and on your left, and you might have completely different perspectives. And so it's really crucial that people just plan and make budget to really have dialogue with children in local contexts, but not just local, you know, local right up to global. Let children be heard. And I think some of the most effective work is been really at this local governance level, because that's where children can get really close to people who have got power and influence, particularly in countries where there's decentralization. And so that's also somewhere I would really encourage governments and, again, NGOs to really invest in, and just not to be scared. I think sometimes people go, oh no, children are going to say this, we're not going to talk to them. So don't be scared, open those doors, listen. You might be surprised about what you hear and find, even if you think you're on the opposite side, you might be surprised, because you know, what children are saying, if you listen to the reasons, they've got reasons for that. And it's not something extreme, it's something very real and very concrete. And they do have a lot of the proposed solutions.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all our panelists and to our audience for joining us tonight. This is the end of our show. Quite punctual, not bad. We do this every couple of weeks, not always about child labor or child work, but we have this regular webinar, and you're always welcome to join us again. And you can sign up for our newsletters, or you can sign up for our Facebook and Twitter on our website, and follow us and see all the new stuff we're putting out. So thank you very much, and have a good night.
Thank you, and bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.